The summer Jordan and I took the camp counselor jobs, we were both 22 years old, freshly graduated, broke in the way that people are broke right after college when the loans have not kicked in yet but the paychecks have stopped, and deeply convinced that spending a summer in the wilderness near Yellowstone was a romantic and adventurous idea that would look good in our memories later. We were right about the memories part, we were wrong about the romantic part, and the adventurous part turned out to mean something neither of us had anticipated when we filled out our applications in Jordan's kitchen in March, eating cereal and laughing about how easy the summer was going to be. My name is Casey Dillon and Jordan's name is Jordan Marsh, and we had been best friends since the 7th grade, the kind of friendship that survives bad haircuts and worse decisions and the particular chaos of growing up in a small town with not enough to do. We had done everything together for 10 years. College applications, road trips, 2 semesters studying abroad in different countries that we spent mostly on the phone with each other anyway. Taking the same summer job felt like the natural continuation of a pattern we had established long before we understood it was a pattern. The camp was called Pinecrest. It sat about 30 miles outside the eastern boundary of Yellowstone on private land that had been operating as a youth camp since the 1960s. 8 weeks, middle school age kids, hiking and kayaking and campfire programs, and the general organized chaos of keeping 60 children alive and mostly happy in the wilderness for a summer. Jordan and I were assigned as co-counselors for a cabin group of 10 12-year-olds, which sounds manageable until you have actually spent time with 10 12-year-olds in a confined space for 8 weeks. We arrived 3 days before the campers did during staff orientation, which was mostly what you would expect. Safety protocols, emergency procedures, activity training, the administrative machinery of a summer camp being explained to 22 new staff members by a director named Helen who had been running Pinecrest for 19 years and had the particular energy of someone who had seen everything that could happen at a youth camp and had built a system to handle all of it. On the second day of orientation, after lunch, Helen gathered the counseling staff in the main lodge and handed out a single sheet of paper to each of us. She said, "These are the camp protocols specific to our location. They are separate from the standard safety guidelines you received yesterday." She said them in the same tone she used for everything, calm and matter of fact, the voice of a person describing ordinary operational procedure. "Read them tonight. If you have questions, see me privately tomorrow morning before the campers arrive." Jordan and I read them together in our staff cabin that evening, sitting cross-legged on our respective bunks with the sheet between us, the sounds of the other staff settling in for the night coming through the thin walls. The sheet had 7 items on it. Rule 1. Do not allow campers to collect rocks or stones from the dry creek bed on the northern trail. If a camper already has one, ask them to return it to where they found it before leaving the trail. Rule 2. The old storage shed at the edge of the eastern tree line is off limits to campers and staff. It is not to be photographed, and if a camper asks about it, tell them it is a maintenance facility and redirect the conversation. Rule 3. If any camper reports hearing their name called from the direction of the tree line after dark, do not investigate the source. Reassure the camper and ensure they remain inside the cabin until morning. Rule 4. Evening campfires are to be fully extinguished by 9:30 without exception. Do not let fires burn past 9:30 regardless of activity or weather conditions. Rule 5. The trail that forks left at the second marker is closed for the season. If a camper asks why, tell them it is a wildlife protection measure, which is partially true. Rule 6. Count your campers every 30 minutes during free period near the lake, not every hour, every 30 minutes. Rule 7. If the camp dog, whose name is Biscuit, refuses to enter an area of the camp or begins barking at a specific location without visible cause, move your group away from that location immediately and note the time and place in your counselor log. Jordan read the whole list and then looked up at me with an expression I knew well from 10 years of friendship. It was the expression that meant she was deciding whether something was funny or serious and had not landed on an answer yet. She said, "Okay, the rock one I get, leave no trace and all that. The fire one makes sense. The counting every 30 minutes is annoying but fine. But what is going on with the shed and the names from the tree line and the dog?" I said I did not know. She said partially true is doing a lot of work in Rule 5. I said I noticed that too. We decided to ask Helen in the morning. We arrived at her office before breakfast and she was already at her desk with coffee, which suggested she had been expecting us or at least expecting someone. She looked at the sheet in Jordan's hand and nodded once. She said, "Which ones?" Jordan said, "Most of them, honestly, but let's start with the shed." Helen set down her coffee. She said the shed had been on the property since before the camp existed, since before the land was privately owned, and that in 50 years of operating Pinecrest she had learned to leave it alone and to make sure everyone else left it alone too, and that this policy had served the camp well and she intended to continue it. I asked what was in it. She said she did not know and that not knowing was something she had made her peace with a long time ago. Jordan asked about the names from the tree line. Helen said it happened several times each summer, always at night, always to one or two campers, never to the same camper twice. She said in 19 years she had never found a source for it and had stopped looking for one in her third year when looking had produced nothing useful and had frightened her considerably more than not looking. Jordan looked at me. I looked at Jordan. Helen said, "I know how this sounds. I want to be clear that in 19 years of running this camp I have never had a serious incident. The rules work, follow them and your summer will be fine." She picked up her coffee again. "The dog one is the most important. Biscuit has better instincts about this property than any person I have ever employed. If she does not want to go somewhere, you do not want to go there either." We left Helen's office and stood in the morning sun outside the lodge, and Jordan said, "Well." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Are we going to follow them?" I said, "Did you see her face when she talked about looking for the source of the names? She was not performing caution. She was describing a lesson she actually learned." Jordan thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, we follow them." We followed them. Every single one, from the first day the campers arrived to the last day of the session. What I am going to tell you now is what happened across those 8 weeks, in the order it happened, as accurately as I can reconstruct it. The rock rule mattered on the 4th day. A camper in our group, a kid named Felix who was 12 years old, endlessly curious and constitutionally incapable of walking past an interesting object without picking it up, came back from the Northern Trail hike with 3 rocks from the dry creek bed in his jacket pocket. He showed them to me proudly during free period, smooth gray stones with unusual banding in them, the kind of thing that genuinely was interesting enough to understand why he had taken them. I remembered the rule. I told him they were cool and asked him to bring them back to the trail tomorrow and return them to where he found them because the camp had a policy about it. He asked why. I told him it was a leave no trace thing. He accepted this without argument because he was, underneath the curiosity, a reasonable kid. He returned them the next morning on the trail hike. I watched him place them back in the creek bed and straighten up and dust his hands on his shorts. That night Felix slept without incident. The 2 nights before, he had woken up twice complaining that someone was calling his name outside. I had followed Rule 3 both times, reassured him, kept him in the cabin. The 3rd night, after the rocks went back, he slept straight through until morning. I did not tell Jordan about the connection until the next day. When I did, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "I am very glad we decided to follow the rules. The shed rule tested us in the 5th week." A group of older campers from a different cabin, 15-year-olds on the senior side of the camp, found the shed during an unsupervised gap in their schedule, and one of them took a photograph of it on a contraband phone before a staff member got there and redirected them. The photograph circulated among the senior campers for about a day before Helen found out about it and quietly ensured the image was deleted. I saw it before it was gone. Jordan saw it too. The shed looked ordinary in the photograph. Weathered wood, a door that had warped slightly in its frame, an old padlock that was more rust than metal at that point. Nothing visually remarkable. What was remarkable was what was in the background of the photograph behind the shed, visible between the shed and the first line of trees, something that the camper who took the photo had either not noticed or not mentioned to anyone. A shape, standing at the tree line. Too tall and too still to be a person standing naturally, and too upright and too defined to be a shadow or a trick of the light. Jordan and I looked at the photograph together on the other counselor's phone before Helen collected it. We did not say anything to each other about what was visible in the background. We did not say anything about it to anyone. We just made sure for the rest of the session that our campers were counted every 30 minutes during free period near the lake and that no one went anywhere near the eastern tree line. Biscuit was a middle-aged golden retriever who belonged to Helen and who had the run of the camp during the day, accepting camper affection with the dignified tolerance of a dog who understood her social role. She was friendly and calm and entirely ordinary in her behavior in most of the camp. She would not go near the Northern Trail after 4 in the afternoon, would not as in she pulled back on a leash. Would not as in she stopped of her own accord at a specific point on the path, sat down, and looked at Jordan or me or whoever was nearest with an expression that communicated, with the particular clarity that dogs sometimes achieve, that she had gone as far as she intended to go, and that we should give serious thought to whether we wanted to continue. We learned to read her the way Helen had suggested. If Biscuit sat down, we changed direction. If Biscuit barked at something we could not see, we moved our group away from it and logged the time and location. We did this without drama, the way you redirect 12-year-olds from anything, with a casual certainty that invites no questions. Our campers never noticed that their movements around camp were being quietly shaped by the instincts of a golden retriever. They just had a nice summer. The Left Fork Trail, Rule 5, I only saw once, and that was enough. Jordan and I were doing an early morning perimeter check during the third week, before the campers were up, walking the outer boundary of the camp property with coffee in paper cups the way we had made a habit of doing on clear mornings. We reached the second trail marker, where the fork went left into the trees. We had redirected campers from that fork a dozen times by then, always smoothly, always with the wildlife protection explanation that Helen had provided, and I had stopped thinking about it as anything other than an operational detail. That morning the light was coming through the trees at a low angle, early sun, and the Left Fork Trail was visible for maybe 30 meters before it curved out of sight. Something was standing in the trail, not at the end of the visible section, about halfway along it, in a shaft of light between two large trees. Standing still, facing us at a distance that made details difficult to resolve clearly. Jordan saw it at the same moment I did. Her coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. We stood at the fork for maybe 10 seconds. The thing in the trail did not move. Then Jordan said, quietly and without any particular drama, we should go back. We went back. We logged the time and location in our counselor books under the notation unusual wildlife observation at Trail Junction, which was the language Helen had suggested for anything we saw that we did not want to describe more specifically in a document that campers might eventually read. We did not talk about what we saw in the trail for the rest of that morning. We had breakfast with our campers and ran the morning activity, and by afternoon it had acquired the quality that certain experiences acquire when you process them in the company of 12-year-olds who need lunch and want to go kayaking. It receded, not forgotten, just placed behind the things that needed immediate attention. Jordan brought it up that night after the campers were asleep, sitting outside the cabin in the dark, both of us with our voices low. She said, "What do you think it was?" I said I did not know. She said it was not a person. I said no. She said it was not an animal either, not one I recognized. I said no. We sat with that for a while. The fire had been out since 9:30, per Rule 4, and the camp was dark and quiet around us, 60 children sleeping in their cabins, the tree line visible as a darker line against the dark sky at the edge of the property. Jordan said, I think Helen has been running this camp for 19 years because she figured out a long time ago that the right response to this place is to manage it carefully and not ask too many questions about the things you cannot answer. I said I thought that was probably right. She said, I think the rules are basically the accumulated knowledge of 19 summers of figuring out what this land requires of the people on it. I said, leave no rocks, avoid the shed, don't let the fire burn past 9:30, trust the dog. She said, and count your kids every 30 minutes. We did. We counted them every 30 minutes for 8 weeks, and at the end of the summer, all 10 of them got on the bus home healthy and full of stories about kayaking and campfires and the time Felix found those cool rocks on the northern trail. None of them knew about the photograph. None of them knew what Jordan and I saw at the Left Fork. None of them knew why Biscuit sometimes sat down on the northern trail in the afternoon and refused to go further. They had the summer they came for, and we gave it to them, and the rules made it possible. Jordan and I drove home together at the end of the session, 8 hours south, the windows down, not talking much the way you do not talk much after an experience that has not finished settling yet. Somewhere around the 4th hour, Jordan said, would you go back? I thought about it honestly. The shed, the shape in the trail. The names from the tree line that had woken Felix twice before the rocks went back. I said, yeah, I think I would. She said, me too. Then she turned up the radio and we drove the rest of the way home in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have been through something together that they do not need to explain to each other because they were both there and they both understood it the same way. Which is the best thing about a 10-year friendship when it comes down to it. You do not always need the words. Sometimes you just need someone in the passenger seat who saw the same thing you saw and made the same choice you made and came out the other side of it with you, heading home in the early evening light.